Hey guys, welcome back to more political chatter. In today's video, we will be talking about my updated election prediction. We are now just 9 days away from the election. This is not my electoral map, this is from 2020, but it does give us a tracker here. 9 days, 4 hours away from election day. It is really amazing to think just how close this election is. And the fact of the matter is, it's closer in date than ever, and it is closer in results than ever. In the projections, it is closer than ever in this race. What an election to be a part of. So, of course, we will start with our safe Democratic states. These are states that are characterized by 15% margin or higher for each candidate. So, these are the Californias of the world. These are the Wyomings of the world. Of course, if Harris was the nominee or any other Democrat, or if it was Joe Biden who was still in the race, all these states would still be safe Democrat. Or if, say, Vance were to take over Trump's spot on the ticket, he would win, say, Wyoming and these other safe Republican states, also by safe margins as well. So these are the states that follow: California, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, Illinois, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, Maine's first district, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Now for Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, they have Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Montana, the Dakotas, Nebraska at large, Nebraska's 3rd district, Nebraska's 1st district, Kansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and that is it. So after the safe states that, of course, we don't need to talk about since they are, in fact, solid and safe and not competitive at all, Harris and Walz do take the early advantage spot at 181 electoral votes. Trump and Vance are at 113. Now we'll move on to likely states. These are characterized as between 5 and 15% margins for each respective candidate, so a bit closer, but we generally know how they're going to vote. It would be a surprise if they did vote the other way. So as for the Democrats, they have quite a few. Again, Kamala Harris really has been able to lock down this set of pretty relatively blue states that were looking very competitive, very battlegroundish. When Biden was leading the Democratic ticket because of his, eroding Democratic support. But in many of these states, Kamala Harris has been really able to build up this Democratic coalition very similar to Joe Biden's in 2020, and she has recovered ground in many of these states. You could just take a look at a state like New Hampshire, for example. I know is a good example. So she's ahead by 5.8% on average right now in the polls. And I'm not going to bring up polls a lot in this prediction. As you all know, I am not a huge fan of polls. They're really not really that helpful in this election, as I've talked about many times. But you can see when it was Biden versus Trump, Trump was ahead by 2, Trump was ahead by 1, even in this poll, Biden plus 3 by 4. And then, of course, Harris has completely recovered. We actually had a poll from Dartmouth University, obviously such an outlier, but actually showed Harris ahead by 21% in a state Biden won by 7 in 2020. So Biden won it by 7. Harris is ahead by 6, so you could see very little eroding support now with Harris leading the top of the ticket. So a state like New Hampshire is likely Dem, as well as Maine, Minnesota, Colorado, New Mexico, and Virginia are all examples of the same scenario as well as Nebraska's 2nd district. There was one time everyone was obsessed with Nebraska's 2nd because it would have resulted in a tie if it went to Trump. Now that's not really a possibility to see it even really that close. Kamala Harris has definitely put a lot of time and effort into Nebraska's 2nd, as the Democratic Party as a whole has, and they have solidified Nebraska's 2nd district for years to come, and it's even helping in that congressional race there. Now, as for Donald Trump's likely states, he also has quite a few. Some we don't need to talk about: South Carolina, Alaska, 2 states that are almost safe, but not quite. They're just below 15 points. Maine 2nd, he won by 8.7 points in the last election. No reason for that to narrow down into a lean characterization, but no reason for it to be over a 15-point margin as well. And then you've got Iowa and Ohio. And I do characterize both these as likely, but in specifically Iowa, I do want to talk about this for a second because, of course, I'm going to wait until I make my final electoral map, my final prediction. Most notable, I mean, obviously, as soon before election day as I can to still get views on the video to make it still relevant. But most of all, because of the Seltzer poll out of Iowa, and it's a state that we don't talk about a lot. Democrats are looking very strong in the early voting, which is weird. They're actually leading in Iowa. However, I'm waiting until the Ann Selzer poll in Iowa. If you don't know, Ann Selzer is the most accurate pollster in the nation, and she very infrequently polls only the state of Iowa. Now, she releases, again, these polls are very infrequent, very rare, but she is releasing a poll from Iowa the weekend before election day. Now, her polls are spot on every time. I'd be shocked if it's more or if it's off by more than a point and a half. So it's extremely important to see where we are in the race in Iowa. Now, we did get a poll from Iowa. It was right after the debate, and it showed a shockingly close race. Harris was down by only 4 points in a state, Iowa, that Trump won by 8. Now look at the date. This was, of course, early September. We have come a long way since then, almost 2 months. So 4 points would be a lean characterization. I think that Trump has gained since then, and it'll be very interesting to see how the state of Iowa does play out. So that does give Donald Trump a boost, and he gets a much larger boost actually from two more crucially important states, Texas and Florida. For the first time in a few weeks, Texas actually shifts from a lean characterization to a likely characterization. I actually have to change. Oh yeah, no, I did change it. It's now over 5% margin for Trump in my forecast. It was 4.9% margin before. I do think that Dems will make very narrow gains considering the rapid leftward trend of the very populous suburbs around Dallas that I think Harris will be able to capitalize on. But still, she is going to suffer too many losses in the rural areas, as well as the increasingly conservative Latino voters in the Rio Grande Valley. Ultimately, Texas will remain pretty stagnant in terms of which way it is trending. So, considering that it did go to Trump by 5.6 in the last election, he won't suffer too much of a loss to make it a lean state. Now, as for Florida, Florida was lean in 2020. It only went to Trump by 3.5%. But of course, the whole state is, of course, obviously trending towards the right, as you have heard. I mean, this was one of the few states we can actually look from 2016 to 2020 that became more Republican. This is the map of how states shifted from 2016 to 2020. You could see only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 states became more Republican, and the most of them, besides Utah, because they had an independent in 2016 that threw everything off. But out of these six, one of them was Florida, and it trended the most towards the right. Plus Hawaii, so 7. It became 2.2% more Republican in 2020, despite the nation as a whole becoming a lot more Democratic. And that was a real wake up call for Democrats. Not only that, you had even a clearer wake up call in the 2022 midterms. DeSantis won re election as governor, Ron DeSantis, by almost 20 percentage points, 19.4%. Ultimately, more conservatives are moving to Florida. That's why it's growing in population. The the Latino population here who does turn out to vote, they are heavily trending towards the Republican Party. The Republican Party of Florida, geez, has done an excellent job courting and capturing these Latino voters, these, pretty socially conservative Latino voters, and economically as well. Remember, Florida, you've got a lot of immigrants from Venezuela, Cuba, Colombia, etc. These, more socialist states who came here to escape socialism, achieve capitalism in the United States, and the Republicans have been very effective in the messaging that the Democrats are the party of socialism. Ultimately, Florida is going to become more Republican. I currently have a 5.3% margin for Trump, now tied with that of Texas. Or not tied, but you know what I mean. So that leaves us with 93 toss up electoral votes across these 7 core battleground states. None of these states, I guarantee you, will be likely for either candidate, and I can say that as a fact. So now we'll move on to lean states. These are states that will be decided by a 1 to 5% margin. So these are the close ones, and they can really go either way. But after this, we have tilt states, which are razor thin and less than 1% margins. So for the Democratic Party, for the Harris-Walz Democratic ticket, they have two critically important lean states. One of them is Michigan. Now, when you look at early voting, I don't know. I'm not smart enough, to be honest, to be completely honest with you, to decipher all of this. They have a strong lead in Michigan, a 14-point lead. Everything that I've seen, I think that this is like Michigan's first early voting this election. I in person, that is, early voting. I think that this is like the first time that they've done it, so we can't really compare it to anything. But everything that I've seen indicates that Democrats are turning out in Democratic area in Democratic strongholds, urban areas, college campuses. I know there was really a surge lately these past few days in early voting, and everything indicates to a strong Democratic performance in Michigan. Again, I'm not going to look at the polls too much because I'll just bring up this one to set the record straight here. The polls are so close where they don't tell us anything. People are so, as have said in my recent videos, 2024 pilled, which means that with the slightest change in polls, right, with Harris going from point 0.2 to point 0.7, everyone is shocked. Everyone goes crazy with the slightest trend in polls, when in any other election, it would go completely under the radar because it doesn't matter. Polling is so easily off 2 or 3 points, where any, shift below that, it barely matters at all because they could just be so slightly off, and it affects who wins the presidential election, who wins each of these states. So I'll just set the record straight for that. But a state like Michigan, Biden won it by the most of any 7 battleground states in 2024. He won it by 2.8%. I don't think that Harris can possibly suffer enough losses in rural areas and among Arab American voters to lose the state. Now, Arab American voters are extremely important. They make up 3% of the state population. That is the biggest problem for Harris in Michigan. But the 2020 margin is important. It's not like a 0.2% margin in Georgia. No, Michigan, this is actually substantial. And as it goes for many of these other states as well, this goes for Pennsylvania, which I'm going to characterize now as a lean Democratic state. I stand by this. You got to look at 2022 results. There's so much to unpack here, and I'm just bringing up the general, not themes, but well, I guess themes, the general themes when making these predictions. I'm not going to go too much into the specifics, but a major general theme is that a lot of these states simply lean Democratic, and Kamala Harris is this sort of generic Democrat where all she needs to do is be relatively competent compared to Biden, be, at all, any level of a normal candidate, and you will be able to capture enough of these Democratic votes in these states that lean Democratic, right? Which means simply more Democrats than Republican voters in the state. And she wins the state. So, what I mean by that, trying to unhighlight Vance there, that looks a little weird. I guess I can't. But what I mean by that is when I bring up the 2022 results, you could see a lot of these states weren't even close. And yes, you had the issue of abortion, which of course is still relevant to this election, so it doesn't really mean anything. Yes, you had very weak Republican nominees, but these margins are insane. Whitmer plus 11 in Michigan, Shapiro plus 15 in Pennsylvania. The Democrat in Arizona won by a point when you round, who didn't campaign, refused to debate, got demolished in her ads, barely had any money, and she still won against Kari Lake. Wisconsin as well, despite a pretty weak Democratic incumbent there. So, these insane margins, right? These 11, these 15-point margins in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. It proves that there is simply a more active Democratic base in a lot of these states. And, that's a key point in this race. So that all Kamala Harris has to do is just be normal, be a normal candidate, because Donald Trump is not. Joe Biden was in 2020. That's how he won. He wasn't in 2024. He was too old. That's why he dropped out. Hillary Clinton wasn't a normal candidate. That's why she lost against Trump. So, despite common consensus, in my view, she wasn't that normal with all things considered, her emails, and everything like that. So, Michigan and Pennsylvania, two states where there is an active Democratic base who turns out in elections. There's simply more Democratic voters than Republicans. That will be critical for Kamala Harris's victory there. Not to mention, early voting, absolutely insane for Democrats in Pennsylvania. They have a 30-point lead with Republicans right now, very in line with the 2022 result, of course, where Shapiro won by 15, and despite all odds, Fetterman won the Senate race by 5. So that's extremely important to look at as well. So Harris, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and I'm honestly pretty confident in both of these. I think that both of them will be over a 1% margin. Honestly, I think that in Pennsylvania, Harris basically matches Biden's margin because of these rapidly leftward trending suburbs around Philadelphia that will only become more Democratic in 2024. So now we'll move on to the single lean Trump state, which is new in this forecast, completely new, that being North Carolina. I think for the first time, in probably months now, nearing 2 months, definitely quite a few weeks, Trump takes North Carolina by a lean margin. I've always been skeptical of North Carolina for Harris. I'm sorry, for Trump. Um, as a lean margin because you got Mark Robinson on the ballot. I think that'll really bring Trump down here. But this was the only one of the seven battleground states that Trump won in 2020 by 1.3%. That's important to keep in mind. It's not just 50-50. Trump did have an edge here in 2020. And considering that Trump has, in many ways taken this race back, made many gains, this would be the first to show. And it is. North Carolina does become lean for Trump. In the remaining states are all tilt. So that means one, two, three, four states are tilt states. In 2020, there were only three. So really, this election could go either way. Harris and Walz are at 260 electoral votes. Trump and Vance are at 235. It all comes down to these remaining four states. So we'll start with Trump and Vance since they're behind to make it more exciting. The first state out of these, the one that would be best for Trump and Vance, that is Arizona. Arizona is not looking good for Democrats at all in the early voting. Republicans are ahead by 6, and this is a common theme in these Sunbelt battleground states. Now, you can't directly compare it to 2020 because now Republicans are possibly running a more pro early voting, more advocating for early voting, even more than Democrats potentially this election cycle, but it's, just about even. So that's not really all that useful, but it does show Republicans are already at a lead in a early start. Not to mention it is the worst of the seven battleground states for Harris, just in the polling average. Compared to the other battleground states, when you compare all of them, that does really tell us a lot. Here, Trump is ahead by 2 in Arizona. Now, this is another change since my last forecast video. I actually had Harris winning Arizona, and this was always a hot take. And it's now moving back to the more, common, the more frequent take that most people have with Trump taking Arizona. I don't think that there's enough slack that Biden gave Harris in 2020 by winning Arizona by only 0.3% for Harris to hold on to it. She is going to probably not excel from 2020 too much in the suburbs in Maricopa County. I don't think, there has been this booming sort of population growth that we have seen in Texas and North Carolina, and what else? Florida, for example, and Georgia, that is. We haven't seen that same type of boost in population in some of these other states in the suburbs. They didn't gain any electoral votes in the 2020 census. So she doesn't have much room to gain there. And then, of course, you've got, these rural regions across the country where she is going to suffer losses, among these white rural men. Biden was, the sort of moderate coded guy. He appealed to a lot of the Republicans in Arizona. And despite Harris's efforts to, bring in many Republicans to her campaign, I don't think it'll be effective enough to carry Arizona. Right now, I have it tilt for Trump. We'll move over to Nevada. I'm so skeptical about this one because the early voting, look, another state where the early voting looks pretty disastrous for Dems. The Republicans lead by 6% in a traditionally strong state in early voting for Democrats. Um, Now, this one has narrowed up a lot recently. You can see that Harris once had a pretty show by 0.3%, but again, that doesn't mean anything. If Harris is ahead by 0.2 or Trump is ahead by 0.3, it doesn't mean anything. But Nevada shows us time and time again that they do have a strong Latino coalition for the Democratic Party, particularly female Latinos. They gave Catherine Cortez Masto a really upset victory in the 2022 midterms. Really, not many people had much faith in her, but she ended up winning that Senate race by 0.8%, despite all odds, all polls showing her losing, and that was a real shocker. You can also bring up Mark Kelly winning by 5 there in Arizona. That's also significant for characterizing Arizona. So Nevada, you do have this really strong Latino female base who I think, and they turned out for Hillary Clinton too. That's important to note. But I think they're going to turn out for Kamala Harris in 2024. Out of the 7 core battlegrounds, in today's standards, they were a bit different in 2016. But out of today's 7 core battlegrounds in 2016, Nevada was the only one to go to Hillary Clinton. There is this unwavering female Latino base in North Carolina for Democrats. And with Roe being overturned now, with it being in a post Roe era, no reason for Nevada to suddenly turn its back. We always think, I mean, we go through this every election cycle. We always think that Nevada is going to flip red. We said it in 2022. Of course, they said it in 2016. Trump actually led in the polls in the 2016 election in Nevada, but it always ends up blue. More of a gut than anything gut feeling. Nevada will stay blue once again. So that leaves us with two states, Wisconsin and Georgia. Whoever, if Harris wins just one of these, she wins the election. So starting with the state of Georgia. Now, as Let's Talk Elections, another channel said, I couldn't agree more. He's saying that Georgia could be a Hail Mary for Democrats in 2024. And it really ties in with Wisconsin. It ties in with the math of the entire map as well. But Georgia right now, I do have till a Democrat. But this is increasingly looking like Harris could take Georgia, which is the first time. If I did characterize Georgia as blue, that would be the first time I would in definitely over a month. This one has been Republican. So Harris has, been losing ground across a lot of states, but not so much in Georgia. She's actually looking much, much better in Georgia. When you look at the polling, I don't think that it's gotten too bad for her. Okay, it has. Never mind. But still, when you look at early voting, there's been a lot of attention around Georgia. Democrats have really narrowed the gap here. More Democratic voters in urban areas around Atlanta, they are starting to turn out. Republicans had a huge lead in the beginning, and Democrats are really closing this gap. Still, though, again, when you look at 2020, what makes me the most skeptical, just like Arizona, not much slack Biden gave Harris now in 2020. He won it by such a razor thin margin where even the slightest of losses across the rural areas could bring a Trump victory in the state. And what's also important is that, there's a new poll from ABC actually revealed today. Harris is not losing much ground at all among black men. There's been so much media attention on this. I don't know why. They just, they like stories to cover and all that. But among black men, this ABC poll actually had Harris gaining from 2020, and that wouldn't surprise me at all. Harris is a black woman, and I know it's not that simple. But there, we go through this same thing every election cycle. Minorities are, I mean, not just minorities. Any demographic group, it can be hard to capture them in polling. There's been too much attention on this notion that Harris is suffering these disastrous losses among black men. There really isn't any clear, concrete, actual past election result evidence that this is happening. So Georgia, there is so much hope for Harris in Georgia. But right now, I have her losing it by the slimmest of margins. But honestly, this one is getting closer and closer and closer, probably a 0.4% margin. So with that, it all comes down to Wisconsin. Now, I'm so undecided. I've never been so undecided in an election prediction as I am now, which is not good because we're only 9 days away from the election. But Wisconsin, I guess Harris is favored. I think that Harris is favored by what? 0.2% margin, 0.1% margin. Because this is another one where, Harris should do fine considering the 2022 results. But Biden did win it by 0.6%. That's a lot better than 0.2% or 0.3%. There is a little wiggle room for Harris, to do half a point worse and still win the state. However, there has been major slacking turnout among Democrats compared to 2020 in the early voting in Milwaukee. It's Milwaukee City specifically, not the suburbs around it. Everything else looks fine. But lots of reports about Milwaukee looking bad for Democrats. They lead by a lot statewide, but you can see, and this goes for every state, but it all matters how the independents are breaking. Because 42%, the plurality of early voters in Wisconsin, are registered independents or other third parties. So it really matters how they are breaking. So to see Milwaukee, that's one thing. To see Democrats have a lead. But it's all decided by the independents. And the fact of the matter is, there's not much turnout in Milwaukee. So regardless of how independents break, regardless of Democrats having leads statewide, it's just not to the levels that it was in 2020. So we have to see if they turn out on election day or if they don't. That is the question. But right now, as I always have had, I have Wisconsin as tilt blue, but I've always been skeptical. I don't think I've ever had Wisconsin as a lean blue state. Even at when Harris was at her peak, I think I still had Wisconsin tilt. I've been the most skeptical out of people having Harris winning the election, which is now becoming a partisan group of, Democratic predictors. I'm not, by the way. There's this group, small group now, increasingly small group, who have, been very confident in Harris in Wisconsin at some point. I have always been so skeptical of Harris's chances in Wisconsin because you've got these white working class voters. There was Trump's best state in 2020 of the blue wall states, and there was Trump's best state in 2016 of the blue wall states. Um, and that is always important to keep in mind. So that's something to remember. Wisconsin, tilt blue right now, and Harris is still favored to win the presidency. I've still never had Trump winning in my forecast. I still believe that Kamala Harris will win the election if it were held tomorrow, but things can change. Again, what are my margins right now? I don't think I've updated Wisconsin. No, oh, sorry. I haven't don't look at that. I haven't updated it, but Wisconsin is, I guess, a 0.2% margin. I don't want to go 0.1 because that just sounds ridiculous. But Wisconsin is a 0.2% margin. Arizona is a 0.6% margin for Trump. Georgia is a 0.3% margin for Trump. These can so easily flip, especially in 9 days, how I'm feeling. Nevada is a 0.5% margin for Harris. These can flip. Don't be surprised to see Georgia blue in my final forecast, Wisconsin red. That would be interesting, but it can happen, and that would actually bump up Harris to 282. That'd be whatever, very interesting. So thank you all for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe down below. That helps out a lot. We're trying to get to 15,000 subscribers before Election Day. Drop a comment to let me hear what your predictions are in the 2024 race. Drop a like, and I will see you all later.